Hello everyone, and welcome back to my monthly member question and answer live stream. Well, it's supposed to be monthly at least, but I actually missed a month, and I'm very sorry for that. It was the Sam Bankman-Fried trial, which for those of you that don't follow cryptocurrency doesn't mean anything, and for any of those of you who are watching who have to report on cryptocurrency, you remember it as several weeks where it was just about the only thing you were allowed to think about. There's a fantastic collection of videos. We did 7 episodes, all with reporters who were in the courthouse for the trial during the course of that. I think that it is one of the best ways to get caught up on the Sam Bankman-Fried trial. You can find those on Crypto Critics Corner and linked in the description. But I'm back here now, and today we are doing the monthly member question and answer live stream, which is where I take questions from the members who help support this channel, and I answer those questions. If you are not currently a member, feel free to hang out. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to participate in the chat or get any questions in, you're going to need to be a channel member. If you're already a channel member and you've got some questions, get them in, and so we'll get cooking on that. In the meantime, George Santos was expelled from Congress, and I haven't even had time to make a video about that yet. My God, isn't that wild? All my old George Santos videos are, of course, linked in the description, though, but it is good to see that there was bipartisan agreement to do that. Once the Republicans were actually sure that he had stolen from the Republican Party, they decided, maybe this isn't a guy we need. Maybe this isn't the kind of attention we want. Without further ado, let's get through these questions, and then we might be able to just hang out for a few minutes. Historic History, glad to see you're here, by the way, hopped into the chat. Previously asked me on the post, can I explain what a Bitcoin ETF is? And I can. An ETF is an exchange-traded fund. It's an investment fund, but structured in a way where the shares in that fund can be easily traded on an exchange like the New York Stock Exchange. This is different than the traditional mutual fund, which generally had a minimum investment and was structured somewhat differently. So exchange-traded funds are just an investment fund that it's easier for you to get into because you can just buy a share of it. The most famous of these are probably some of the, well, there's lots of variations, right? You have the index funds that are trying to track the S&P 500. You have the inverse of many of those, the things that are shorting the entire S&P 500 or shorting the entire NASDAQ. But at its basis, it's an investment fund that is traded on a securities exchange in a form where these shares represent a share in that fund. A Bitcoin ETF, therefore, is a fund holding Bitcoin or something meant to closely track the value of Bitcoin that's traded in this manner. There already are Bitcoin ETFs, and we talk about this in a Crypto Critics Corner episode you can find linked down in the description, but they're futures-based ETFs. What that means is that the funds are allowed to hold futures that are supposed to track the price of Bitcoin, but don't hold Bitcoin itself. And these types of ETFs have been approved, but the types of ETFs that would hold Bitcoin have not been approved. I think from the most technical administrative point, the SEC lost their argument when they approved one specific futures-based Bitcoin ETF, which is the Teucrium Bitcoin ETF, because it went through under a different version of the Securities Act, which is the one that spot ETFs would generally be approved under. Previously, the other futures-based ETFs had gone through a different path. Because of that, there was possible to kind of draw a distinction and pretend that the SEC's case for approving futures-based ETFs and not approving spot-based, which are the ones that actually hold Bitcoin, was based on that distinction. Moving away from something that's only interested in people who are unhealthily related to securities regulations is the fact that futures-based ETFs for something like Bitcoin are almost objectively worse for almost every type of consumer. The reason for that is because you are holding these futures, there is a cost associated with that. And because there is time duration to these contracts, there is roll associated with these contracts, and there are costs associated with that. What that inherently means is that the type of ETF that has been approved by the SEC or has been allowed to exist by the SEC, because some of this isn't really approval, it's not stopping them. Like if the SEC doesn't say stop, it like goes into effect. So it's not an explicit approval, and people behind those companies can't call it an approval. But for our effect as consumers, they exist in that market and can be traded. These futures-based ETFs, because of these extra costs, do a worse job of tracking the cost of Bitcoin, are more prone to problems, and are less likely to be understood by the average consumer. Yet they exist, and spot ETFs don't. I think that's dumb. I think if you're going to allow the bad one to exist, you should allow the slightly less bad one to exist. However, and this is kind of where we go back into some other things, the reason this has been important more recently, which was part of Historic History's question, is because there have been some administrative developments that seem to make it more likely that either a Bitcoin ETF will be approved or that there will be conversion of existing products like the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, GBTC, which is a separate product which I can discuss in a moment, would be allowed to convert to an ETF. This is related to a couple of court rulings and some other filings, but suffice it to say, it has become increasingly likely that the SEC will allow spot Bitcoin ETFs to exist. The reason people seem to care about spot Bitcoin ETFs is because they seem to believe that if there was a product that closely tracked the price of Bitcoin that investors could purchase through exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange or in NASDAQ, that would make it so that they would want to buy a lot more Bitcoin. They think that there's barriers that are preventing a whole class or multiple classes of investors from currently accessing Bitcoin, and that a spot ETF would allow those investors to access it, and in doing so would improve the value of Bitcoin. Now, related to this, Historic History asked, doesn't this kind of go against the whole ethos of Bitcoin as peer-to-peer currency? And it does, but Bitcoin isn't really about peer-to-peer currency and hasn't been for years. The Bitcoiner ethos itself focuses far more on hodling, holding the coins and assuming that they'll either store or appreciate in value, rather than actually transacting with merchants or other people in the economy using the coin. More and more of the thesis surrounding Bitcoin investments and things like that has been that its value will increase, and by its value increasing, it will prove itself ever more valuable in a way that will make its value increase. Now, you may say that type of self-perpetuating cycle sounds like absolute economic nonsense, and I'm not here to stop you from saying that. Now, what that type of thesis requires is for you to find more and more ways for Bitcoin to be embedded in various economies, in collateral, in lending, in places where it is accepted as like a likely thing to have value. When that happens, maybe you think Bitcoin starts to be needed by people in their central bank reserves or something, if you take the idea through to its end. However, more practically, the reason you see YouTube channels and shills on Twitter or whatever excited about a Bitcoin ETF is because they hope it'll make them more money. It's not about an ethos of Bitcoin as a censorship-resistant mode of value transfer or something like that. It is entirely about a potential appreciation in the assets they have invested in, and that is what they're holding out hope for. There is a bit, and this is also related to something Historic History asked on question, there is a bit of post-Sam Bankman-Fried with him in prison, and now with Changpeng Zhao and Binance, which we can get to in a second. There is a bit of crypto trying to prove it's not just that. You need to, if you want to continue to avoid regulator or law enforcement ire, You need to provide some argument as for how you are providing actual value, regulated value. And so something like a Bitcoin ETF operated by someone like BlackRock looks like a legitimate cryptocurrency institution to the types of people, meaning in this case, like Wall Street politicians and regulators, that there is a regulated path for this industry. Broadly, I think a Bitcoin ETF will have negligible effects on the market, if at all. I think just about anyone who wants to own Bitcoin can currently own Bitcoin. And I worry some underestimate the value of certain institutions gaining ways to reliably short Bitcoin. We'll see how that plays out. Mark, or Marky, who's in the chat with us here today, also sent in a question where he said, in the golden age of scams, what would I say are the top 5 crypto-related scams? And I don't know that I really rank scams like that. I study them because I find them fascinating and I want to better understand them, and they don't rank top in my head like that. And there's also a little bit of a distinction in my head between Terra Luna, right, is obviously one of the largest frauds of all time, measured in certain ways, but it was still kind of isolated, and the headline values you put on it are $60 billion, $80 billion ecosystem or whatever, but the actual money invested into the ecosystem was much smaller, say 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, whatever. It's smaller by an order of 20 or 80 compared to the headline number. And so there's kind of the most interesting crypto scams to me tend not to be something like Terra Luna. I covered Terra Luna before its collapse. I wrote my long research piece for the FUD letter where I talked about the mechanisms that I thought would contribute to its collapse. And then notoriously, Cass and I on Crypto Critics Corner covered it just 6 days before it totally collapsed. And at the time, we had delayed covering it for so long because it wasn't that interesting, because it was so clearly a scam. And so part of what has been my struggle over the last few years especially is grappling more and more with how institutions and stuff have missed so many of these scams. Why there were so many big firms in Terra and Luna. Why were there so many big firms in FTX and Alameda Research? And so that has been drawing more and more of my attention. And so I think what's been most interesting is looking at the ones that have gained some amount of legitimacy before their collapse, right? So top 5, let's go Terra Luna, right? Because they had convinced a lot of people that this was actually a real thing and wasn't just an exploitive Ponzi. You need FTX and Alameda Research, just pure scale, complexity of operations, and how interestingly it meshes with other cryptocurrency firms. Going from there, then you kind of have to, I think, go for something like Celsius, I think, is again one that seemed so brazen in the scam to me from the beginning, but received investment from CDPQ and stuff like that. And so again, it's what is the due diligence of those firms? And then I would also, Axie Infinity, I think, has to make the list just due to the scale of human exploitation that came from, again, just brazen pyramid scheme economics. That's enough scams. I've named enough scams. And do I have any investigations heating up? Always. I'm trying to see if there's anything I can say. There's always several things I'm cooking on. Not investigation-wise, but I did find a new Fred Shabesta documentary I might watch and make a video about. Investigation-wise, I'm interested in stablecoins, believe it or not, especially, the biggest and most important stablecoin, and especially their clients, especially clients who still exist in a world without Alameda Research, and what types of things they're doing. Yeah. Though that's also a thing I'm kind of always investigating, so that's not that specific. Getting to the chat questions, Sam Bankman-Fried's sentence. I think he'll probably get about 20 years, but I don't have any reason to think that my guess is accurate. I'm not a prosecutor. I don't have specific insight here. His complete lack of remorse will definitely go against him, as will the size. Plus, it's kind of difficult for him to flip up. We talk about this a little bit in the one of the more recent episodes of Crypto Critics Corner, where we had on Liz Lopatto from The Verge, and we talked kind of about that and grappled with what's an appropriate sentence for someone in this kind of role, because there is serious harm from these white collar frauds, but there is also this dynamic where the American penal system focuses so much on revenge in a way that really is awful. And there was this same kind of dynamic when we've tried to discuss the prison systems and some of the problems with it obliquely in Crypto Critics Corner a couple times. And there's always this dynamic where people think that we're for the criminals. And so I don't really know what an appropriate sentence is. I think white collar criminals often get off too easy. And I'm not really worried about Sam Bankman-Fried getting off too easy, right? He was a billionaire with access to great lawyers. But broadly, I think our penal system needs better spent funding, far fewer people in it, and such massive overhauls. I feel bad condemning anyone, basically no matter what they did to that system. Comments on CZ and Binance. Yes. Many, namely, I think once we realized they had a head of MLARS negotiating on their behalf, we should have, thank you, Historic History, I appreciate that, and congratulations on becoming Dr. Historic History now. Returning, I think that Binance and CZ have been preparing for this point, this negotiated settlement, for quite some time. Reuters reported, I think 20 months ago, 24 months ago, that they had the former head of MLARS, the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Service, in the Department of Justice negotiating on their behalf with the current head of MLARS for this settlement. Some other things to keep in mind, the total amount paid is about 3 times what HSBC paid for their money laundering offenses. And so in terms of scale, it's pretty appropriate that way. I also want to emphasize that there's other things the United States could do, right? The United States very often has a lot of options on how to manage this type of problem. And so they could have pursued certain people as fugitives, effectively sent them off to non-extradition countries and made them live the rest of their lives there, right? You could tell that CZ had some plans surrounding that possibility. In a sense, though, this gets the United States closer to several of the things it needs. I discussed in a newsletter long ago about when the United States did their big announcement about capturing BitSlotto, that I thought Binance was going to be their next big crypto press conference. And I think I was wrong because Sam Bankman-Fried. But I was right in the fact that that seizure happened because they got access to Alphabay and the Hydra darknet market. And with that information, then they were then able to identify flows out to all these other exchanges, all these other entities and things like that. Once they took out BitSlotto, Binance was the largest other Hydra counterparty standing. So what the United States government has been able to get out of this is basically equivalent access to Binance as if they had done a full seizure, right? They have independent monitors from FinCEN, OFAC, the Department of Justice, the CFTC, all reviewing every single transaction and every single historic transaction for Binance. And that is a lot of information about a lot of different entities. In the meantime, a lot of the liquidity and crime will no longer be occurring on Binance and will gradually move to other places. But unless those people who move to those other places are quite careful, there's a very good chance they interacted with Binance and might accidentally incriminate themselves again. And so in doing this, the US takes out Changpeng Zhao as like a continuing criminal threat. They relegate Binance to history in the cryptocurrency industry, probably. That's what generally happens when law enforcement and regulators finally engage with these firms, as they get relegated off to the sidelines. And the U.S. Department of Justice, FinCEN, and OFAC gets extensive transaction records from almost every single major entity in the cryptocurrency industry and how they interacted with Binance, Binance US, Merit Peak, Sigma Chain AG, and everyone else over that entire time period. And they're going to be filing SARs on all of them, is what they said. And so there was a part of me that wanted Binance to get like the corporate death sentence, for there to be like this to be treated as the legitimately serious money laundering operation it was. But the US government does kind of what I predicted it would. They took the deal, they got the access, and in so doing, they'll now be able to monitor more and more of those entities that they're interested in. And in that process, we'll see a whole nother bunch of busts now start to cascade down from Binance towards a bunch of their counterparties based on that. I think there is one last interesting wrinkle, and that is we talked about this in our The SEC Sues Binance and Coinbase episode of Crypto Critics Corner, which is that Binance said in their statement then that they had been trying to negotiate a settlement with the SEC before the SEC sued them. And the SEC chose not to take that at that time. They thought they had such a good case that they should still take it to trial. And anyone who knows my thoughts on the SEC knows that's unusual. The SEC loves these deals because they get to go to Congress then and say, we closed this many things. We were able to get this many dollars back from them. Look at all the great things we're doing, without actually having to spend like trial attorney time on these cases. But they took Binance there, despite Binance publicly admitting they wanted a deal. Now this new negotiated settlement includes the CFTC, includes OFAC, includes FinCEN, includes the Department of Justice, but still does not include the SEC. That's unusual to me. I'm not fully sure what it means. It might just be that the SEC thinks it's got a really strong case and wants to take it through to its conclusion and get what they can out of it. But there's something unusual to me about all those other cases closing and the SEC one not closing. And I haven't fully parsed it yet. I don't really fully understand it yet. And I'm not sure I'm going to anytime like really quite soon. I think that broadly is kind of what I'm thinking on CZ and Binance. There is a playlist of all of our Crypto Critics Corner episodes about Binance on Crypto Critics Corner that you should check out if you want some of my more historic thoughts. I have not seen the BBC fictional fraud show Hustle, Historic History. But yeah, I think that's all the questions. I want to thank you all for joining me back here today. I do think I'll have some good new videos on here in the future. I think I am probably going to do that Fred Shabesta one, but we'll see. I might have thoughts on Elon Musk's continued destruction of Twitter and his relationship with advertisers. So I may have comments on that New York Times Dealbook Summit. I need to decide if I want to wade into the morass that is Musk fans, but hey, you know, that's where the clicks come from. And then there's a couple of other kind of interesting political things that have been happening that I might catch up on. I wish Menendez would, resign, but hey, can't get everything you want apparently. Yeah. Thanks for stopping by. See y'all at the next one.